All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sean Connor, Director of Student Affairs for Saylor Academy. Welcome to our final panel of the day and of the summit. We're going to conclude the event with a networking lunch. From all of our panels yesterday and today, you can see that the skills gap, which manifested as a talent gap, a credential gap, a capacity of education gap, or an opportunity gap, really affects all of us. As we are increasingly interconnected, serving the underserved is actually making sure we enable all of the talent available in the world by providing the skills and knowledge they need to make our world a better place. In order to see true access to education reach everyone, we will need to develop sustainable curricula that can be used easily by schools, organizations, and students in need. Open Education Resources, OER, to paraphrase Dr. Sheila Jagannathan, allow us to gather the knowledge, best practices, and brain trust of academia and provide opportunities around the world to teach, skill, and reskill. I'm very pleased to introduce this afternoon our closing panel. OER is poised to close the global skills gap. We have with us today Mark Singer, Dean of Undergraduate Studies at Golden Gate University, as our moderator. Thank you, Mark. Dr. Rajiv Jangiani, Associate Vice Provost of Open Education at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. Dr. Bakari Diallo, CEO of African Virtual University. And Jacqueline Arnold, Director of Strategic Relationships and Communications at Saylor Academy, to talk about how OER is and can be leveraged to support sustainable development goals and educate the underserved. And with that, Mark Singer, if you'd like to take it away.
All right, thanks for staying. This is a shorter panel than the others, so it'll be a little punchier, right? So get your questions in quickly. But we'll do what we can to try to think about how to sum everything up. We've been really tasked with I guess a provocative statement to address, which is OER is poised to close the global skills gap. That's what we're going to be working with here today. So what I'd like to do before we get into that question or affirming that statement, if that's what it turns out to do, I would first like to define what OER is, and then I will introduce the members of the panel, and then we can just take it from there. And of course, if you have questions, by all means, feel free to ask. So this is sort of hot off the presses from UNESCO, a very current working definition of OER, open educational resources. And it's probably too long for you to, unless you write really fast, to get this all down. But you could certainly look it up on UNESCO's site. OER are learning, teaching, and research materials in any format and medium that reside in the public domain or are under copyright that have been released under an open license that permit no-cost access, reuse, repurpose, adaptation, and redistribution by others. All right? So that is the topic for today. So before I go any further, then let me allow each of the panelists to introduce him or herself. Why don't I start with you, if you don't mind?
Well, good afternoon. I was already introduced earlier. I think that so perhaps my name is Bakari Diallo. I work for the African Virtual University.
Thank you. My name is Rajiv Jangiani. I serve as the Associate Vice Provost, as mentioned, for Open Education at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, which is a public post-secondary institution in Vancouver, Canada. And there I shepherd the open education and open recognition initiatives.
I'm Jacqueline Arnold. I'm the Director of Strategic Relationships and Communications at Saylor Academy. I oversee outreach, which includes being one of the leads putting together the summit, as well as marketing management for Saylor Academy.
And probably all of you have been working with Jackie at some point or another if you're here today. And this is not what the panel's about, but Jackie's just done a fabulous job pulling this all together.
Thank you very much.
It's really good to start off with a round of applause. Right? I just think it can't. All right. So let me just ask each of you a sort of a straightforward question, and I think it'll start the ball rolling just by itself. But could you talk about how you're currently engaged with OER in your current work?
Thank you. In my current work at African Virtual University, we actually have the biggest open educational resources library in Africa. And we started this as far as 2005, when AVU adopted OER policies in our organization. By 2008, we work with 10 universities across Africa in French, Portuguese, and English to develop 4 Bachelor of Education in math, chemistry, biology, and physics. So those bachelor were developed in such a way that they can be delivered online and face-to-face. But the most important part of this related to OER is all these materials there were, I think, about 200 courses were released as open educational resources. And the resources were in French, English, and Portuguese. And the reason behind is that we had received public money. It was a donation to develop these courses. So we agree as a policy with those universities that it would be better to release those courses, those programs, those OER, so that more Africans can actually benefit from it. So I think that was the start, and then we added more. But the story is, as of 2010, 2011, when we built our portal and post those resources as open educational resources, we found out that the first country actually accessing the resources was Brazil, because we have resources in Portuguese.
Which is not in Africa.
Brazil is not in Africa. and the second was actually the United States of America. Yeah. And then we have France. And I think the first African country was fourth, and was, I think, Kenya. I think, if building to what I said earlier, opening up, having OER doesn't translate into access. It'll take more than just having the OER. So that's perhaps my introductory and how we are linked to OER.
That's great, and I might ask us I was thinking of asking that as a general question later, does OER by itself equal access? And of course, it doesn't, but I'd like to have the rest of us engage in that too once everyone's had a chance to talk about what they're doing. But I think you really raise a key point for this panel anyway. Thank you. Rajiv,
Thank you. The answer varies. Certainly my background before I moved into this work was as a faculty member in psychology. So certainly organically over the years, I've authored open textbooks and adopted them. But from an institutional lens, we do a lot of work with open educational resources. We have many faculty authors. We create and publish open textbooks, for example. We adapt a lot of open educational resources that have been created elsewhere and reuse them. And we are the leading institutional adopter of OER in Canada. Over the years, we've developed, our most recent one is our 7th degree program that's entirely zero textbook cost because they're built around open educational resources. More than 700 courses at this point across every discipline you can imagine that have zero textbook cost. So for us, open educational resources are massive in several ways. One, undoubtedly cost savings for students, several $1 million across the last couple of years. But incredibly also about student persistence, about student performance. We're seeing it's a big part of our institutional strategy. And of course, beyond the free reuse of resources, we try to take advantage as much as possible of the ability to revise and remix and contextualize and localize. And so there's quite a bit of pedagogical innovation that's poured into it to make the resources locally relevant, updated as quickly as possible, semester by semester, for example, making them interactive, but increasingly also working not just with the resources, but thinking about the wider practices. So one of the threads I'll start to pull out from the title of this panel anyway is we should probably be talking about open educational practices instead of just open educational resources. So hopefully we can start to get into the open pedagogies where students can get involved in the creation and updating of resources as part of their program of study. So I'll stop there for now.
So there are clearly implications beyond just the availability of textbooks for free, that OER really promises anyway. All right, thank you. Jackie, if you don't mind, so I'll ask you the question again. How are you engaged with the use of OER in your current work, or how is Saylor engaged, if you prefer?
So OER is really the backbone of what Saylor does. As many of you may know by now, Saylor Academy creates courses by curating OER resources into a self-paced asynchronous format that students can use to gain knowledge. We don't just list OER into the course, we really provide framing around that and provide additional resources where there are gaps. We work with college professors to do that and to peer review that. We're then able to take those courses and have them reviewed for college credit acceptance by the American Council of Education or a national college credit recommendation service. Not only does OER enable us to do what we do because we don't have to charge students to access or use our courses or charge organizations to access or use our platform, it also enables other organizations to use us. And I think that's one thing that I hope that we are able to hit on as well. We have several examples of programs. We've mentioned and shouted out Central Union Mission before, who have incorporated our courses into their transition back to work program. We worked with an organization, actually worked with is kind of a loose term. We didn't even know that they were doing this. People have found us and found different ways to use us. So when you think about Creative Commons, open licensing, it really is enabling the creativity of the commons to be able to use these resources to serve those in need. So OER it really is the backbone of everything we're able to accomplish and that our partners are able to accomplish as well.
Great. But all of you have, I think, hinted, maybe you less than the others, that the open materials themselves are not sufficient. Mm-hmm. That's not enough to do. You can't just create open materials, put them out there, and say, my job is done, right?
Yes.
So I wonder if you wouldn't mind, and you talked about this earlier as well. I wonder if you wouldn't mind, Bakri, expanding upon that idea, unless I'm putting words in your mouth about that.
But we found that actually our model is, I would say, is to work with universities. Our partners are universities. So first of all, it's important that the OER be contextualized. So what we do for that is that the content developers are from our partner universities.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
I see. So the universities themselves.
The universities themselves. So basically, if we have, for instance, developing a Bachelor of Education, so sometimes you have to develop some 40 courses because we have to make them available in French, English, and Portuguese. Mm. But the one writing the courses are from one of the partner institutions. This is important because then they can see that this is one of their own who developed the course. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we want to make sure that these courses have international standards. So in the process, we have consultant colleagues from all over the world to make sure that actually we have world-class courses. So once this happens, we have agreement with our partners that they are actually going to offer the programs. So the curriculum goes to their Senate, it's approved, and all of those things, so that once the program is developed, it is actually offered through the partner institution. They have the capacity to do it face-to-face, they have the capacity to do it online.
So they can do it face-to-face as well?
Absolutely. So now, what we are talking about is how we can add value for all the universities, like in Africa. I must say that access to quality content is an issue. Access to quality content is one of the issues of accessing quality higher education. Mm-hmm. And that's where we struggle to have all the universities who are not part of this network actually uptake or just be aware and use the resources.
Well, that is part of the mission of the African Virtual University, right? To make sure that quality materials are available to everyone.
Absolutely. So we find ourselves doing sensitization campaigns, traveling to countries, writing to universities, writing to governments, but the uptake of what is already available is not at the level or we are satisfied.
Very good. All right. Thank you. So Rajiv, you're at a university, not one that's working with that, the African Virtual University, but there are different challenges, I guess, on your side, or there's more to OER than, as you started to suggest, than just the materials themselves. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll maybe qualify that by just saying we're not working with the AVU yet,
Yes.
but we might be soon. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to slight OER at all. So many things to acknowledge. I mean, you think about places like Poland, for example, where the e-Podręczniki program has a full set of textbooks for primary and early secondary programs. Brazil was represented in the room earlier. I think, is Pablo still here? But yeah, so I want to get this right. The Programa Nacional de Livro Didático, for example, has openly licensed resources as part of a requirement in the program. 10 million open textbooks were distributed in South Africa through the Siyavula program across 2 years, for example. OER themselves are having a huge impact. Even institutionally, when the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands releases public domain copies of the masterworks, it suddenly makes the study of art history more accessible than it would have been for formal and informal learners, especially if you know the cost of art history books. It's primarily the copyright involved that holds that price so high. And even interactive resources like the University of Colorado at Boulder has released these interactive simulations called PhET, P-H-E-T, incredibly high quality resources. So I think OER itself is staggering, but it is, again, to quote an earlier panelist, a yes and situation. All right, so certainly it needs a lot more. It needs, I mean, we can talk about open recognition and where we go with this, but we're talking increasingly about the practices. So you can take an openly licensed free resource and treat it exactly the same as you would a commercial proprietary resource, the difference being the cost to the institution or to the student. But of course, the open licensing allows you to do a lot more. So, I mean, Bakary, you're referencing in some ways, I think, the reusability paradox of OER. The more universally you design a resource that it can be used anywhere, the less useful it is in any particular context. Right? So when you develop resources, developing it with an eye to that, making it as modular as possible, making it so it can be localized. Just as a quick floating example, there's an open textbook project here in the US based at Rice University in Houston called OpenStax. And they have a couple of dozen very high quality open textbooks, one of which is for astronomy. And it's fantastic. But this is a good example of where you can't release that and say, well, we've solved that problem, we've got a great astronomy textbook, because the sky looks a bit different from the southern hemisphere, for example. So it's a good example. So taking advantage of the ability to revise and remix, but also thinking about how we can actively involve our students in their skill development while at the same time making the resources as relevant as possible. So one quick final example, economics theory, you think about macroeconomics, is not necessarily something that will change from one semester to the next, but increasingly, for example, we're seeing our students getting involved where part of their course assignment involves digging into public domain government databases. In our case, it's Statistics Canada. Over here, it might be the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And their job is exercising, developing research, statistical, graphical skills. The students, every single semester, are updating the charts with the latest unemployment stats. It's part of their coursework. It is dynamic, it is localized, but it's also involving their own skill development. So I think when we think about the practices, it's useful to think about students not just as consumers, but as co-creators, and thinking about the information and digital literacies that are necessary to make that happen. I think those literacies are exactly the kinds of literacies that we've heard about earlier today as well.
Yeah. Excellent. Do these kinds of things, these kinds of challenges pose particular problems for Saylor? Like how do you manage these sort of not competing demands, but unique demands that come to you from probably all the many institutions that you work with?
So I think some of the challenges that we see when we're talking about OER by itself maybe not being the complete solution, we get a lot of requests for having supporting course materials, test banks. And I think in the OER community, there are still a lot of conversations about how do you make OER that compete with commercial resources when usually the commercial textbook comes with a software pack or access pack or auto grading. Those things cost money to create, and usually the people who create them rightfully want to license them so that they're able to recoup that investment. How can we engage the OER community in creating test banks, instructional support, so that we can make those tools more useful, support the pedagogies that you discussed before, and really give them the bells and whistles, if you will, that a commercial textbook would have. I think that's something that maybe is more particular to the U.S., but anywhere where textbook cost is a concern, I think that's something that we have to look at as well. Those are usually the conversations that we hear about at Saylor Academy.
Mm-hmm. And because you're working with largely OER materials, institutions can customize these things for themselves or add their own additional resources if they like. So
they can, but it's easy to forget, and I talk to universities a lot as part of my work, that faculty time is an expense as well. And so universities are very sensitive to that. And sometimes it's even hard to say, well, here's this resource, you can customize it as you wish, when you have a textbook resource or software or an LMS that can just kind of give it to them and grade it for them. It's hard to compete with that. And even when we're talking about partnering, sometimes universities are looking at resources or partners that have all of those things included at a cost that they can pass on to the students. So that's something that I'd love to see kind of resurface in conversations as well.
And I just want to say this, I don't know if any of you have much familiarity with open educational resources and the development over the last few years, but for many years, almost all of the panels and all of the conferences that I've attended on OER had this almost like messianic zeal about them. Everything, it's a utopia, the world is going to, crack open and we're all going to be living happily ever after, and the angels will come down from, all right, I made that last part up, but it was just so, people would always speak about how wonderful it is, and I think what you're hearing here is not necessarily a set of criticisms of OER, but to me it really reflects sort of the maturity of the movement, so that it may not even be a movement anymore, but it's something that's more and more commonly just accepted. And with that in mind, then, we're able to sort of explore not only the wonderful positive things, but also some of the challenges and some of the top issues that need to be addressed, if you will. So I hope no one's taking this as like, yeah, see, that's not going to work, it's too hard. It's just the opposite, I think, what I'm hearing here so far. So with that in mind, one of the other questions that you mentioned just, Bakri, that this can also be delivered, used in face-to-face settings and more traditional classroom settings. It's usually the case that people think of OER as being very much about online learning. We did not in advance discuss this, but can you talk about, are there differences or are there challenges that come into play when you're thinking about how to take something that is really associated with the technological developments of the last few years and trying to make it work in a more traditional setting?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. But I want to build on what Jackie was saying.
Oh, of course.
I think to move to the next step, we're thinking about the sustainability of the model.
Absolutely.
Because we are basically providing the resources for free. And to move to the next level, you really need to invest to make it accessible.
Yes.
So that people actually to create an environment or people can teach and learn. And it's costly. So the issue is, how are we going to meet that cost and make it free? It's one of the issues. So I must say that actually we have made a lot of progress and a lot of tons of millions maybe of resources are available. It's just like how we can actually make the best use of what is existing. So I'm not criticizing that we have resources, but I'm saying how we can help with OER, for instance, for massification in Africa. So that's the kind of thinking that I have right now. So now,
So why don't we stay with that? That's kind of more interesting than what I was asking.
but you asking me is interesting.
I don't see them as unrelated in some ways, but
Yeah. So what you're asking is because most of our partner institutions in Africa are traditional universities.
yes, that's what I was thinking.
So, for instance, the latest bachelor we developed together is a bachelor in applied computer science.
Computer science.
Yes. So most of them, after all of them, were teaching this course face to face. They still have it. But you know, when you use technology, you want to improve teaching and learning in the classroom also. So we are basically doing two things: improving the existing curriculum or existing program they have, and have an online version of it. So they will keep on teaching if they wish to, and they have an online version of it.
So they'll have the options.
Yes. And the implication is sometimes it's hard to trace the impact of your OER because you don't know who's using it. But you have some stories from Africa and outside of Africa that actually a faculty of education was looking at developing the resources that we have, and they discovered that actually it was there. What they have done, they have looked at, they downloaded the materials, adapted to their needs, instead of developing a new set of for Bachelor of Education, for instance. So there are different use that people are making of the open education resources. We do not know necessarily how they are using it, so we cannot measure the real impact on the ground.
Right. So I'm going to try and probably fail at this. To connect the two questions that we're sort of floating. On the one hand, there's the macro question of how do you support this kind of thing? How do you create an infrastructure for this? But on the other hand, at the micro level, if you will, this is an opportunity for schools, universities to maximize, to make better use of their resources by adapting something that you've created. All right. So how was that? That was good, right? No, I just threaded it. Rajiv.
There's a few other connections, I think, because when you're developing an institutional strategy for this, you are thinking about both levels. So you certainly, how do I put this? So digital delivery, of course, allows several affordances that you wouldn't have otherwise. But one of the reasons why you don't quite ever know the full extent of the impact of your work with OER is because, as you say, you might be making strategic decisions about data privacy. Maybe we do not want to collect that, for example. Maybe we do not want to make data the price of admission to gain access to free resources, for example. That's a choice we make as an institution. Similarly, think about accessibility and what you can bake into the resource to make it compatible with screen readers and other assistive learning technologies. You develop strategies to deal with what's called digital redlining, not assuming, for example, getting caught up with the techno-solutionism, that the digital is always the solution.
Can you talk about what digital redlining is?
Yeah, so I mean, this comes from the concept of redlining itself, which has quite a history in this country, certainly. Think about loans and lending practices where, depending on which particular geographical boundary you were coming from, housing loans were incredibly difficult to get. And these were, of course, along racial boundaries, places like Detroit, 8 Mile Road, for example. And so today, you think about digital redlining in the sense of, do not assume that all of your students, all of the learners have access to digital technologies, digital devices, broadband internet. They may have the phones, so they may not have access to the data. So thinking through what your strategy is. And so, of course, you're not able to estimate the impact, but you know it will always be an underestimate anyway. But think about, for us, print on demand is a big part of it. Different modalities, the ability to use it offline. Commonwealth of Learning, yesterday we're talking about some of their technologies where they're able to host a local network without necessarily internet, but having a local network to share the OER. And there's other groups that have done the same thing. But I wonder also, sorry, just a couple of other points, the broader context. Because I feel whenever we talk about OER, we sometimes walk past the broader forces we're grappling with. I mean, Many of you are aware the forces that are pushing us towards the sort of the neoliberal university. And we're dealing with increasingly precarious faculty. More than 50% of them, 75% in this country, are contingent, precarious faculty without a stable full-term employment. Increasingly precarious students, right? The majority of students in this country, for example, are not traditional students. So the term loses meaning. So if you've got precarious faculty working with precarious students, and then in the context of that, we're talking about commercial proprietary resources that between 1977 and 2016 rose in cost more than 1,000%, more than 3 times the rate of inflation. So we're talking about, these are not neutral waters, is what I'm trying to point to. So in some sense, we're dealing not just with access, we're trying to deal with equitable access. We're dealing not just with access, we're talking about agency and control and autonomy for faculty, for students. And when you talk about institutional systems, it takes a lot of investment, no doubt. But I do see shifts. So for example, in my backyard, the big research institution is the University of British Columbia, and they've revised their tenure and promotion policies to recognize the creation of open educational resources for tenure and promotion. Those are the kinds of signals, I think, that for institutions make a huge difference. But I'll close by just saying, locally, in our context, institutions don't often raise this question when we talk about strategies for student recruitment or student success or faculty development. And yet all of these are areas that are deeply served by working in open educational resources. Certainly we've seen it with not just research in my context, huge University of Georgia study I'm thinking about, more than 10 institutions, 20,000 students. And not only did the adoption of OER enhance student performance across the board, but it disproportionately increased performance for first-in-family students, for Pell recipient students, for students who've been historically underserved by higher education. And so this is why it comes back to me about, and we were talking about this yesterday, not just access, but the question of equitable access. And in thinking through what that means for an institution that really wants to provide higher education as a vehicle for economic and social mobility, and not just as a vehicle that reinforces and replicates existing power structures.
It's a very tough act to follow. But it does bring to mind a couple of conversations that I had been a part of. Recently, I went to the World Bank Fall meeting, and a couple of representatives were discussing the cost of data. So when we're thinking about creating OER, we have to think about, yes, would it be more engaging if we had this great interactive video or module where people can move things around? That might be fantastic, but one young lady was mentioning that for her startup, for just a few employees, the cost of data per month was $1,000 in US dollars, and it was almost enough to cripple her enterprise. She needed, particularly because she had trouble either getting loans or securing funding, she was investing a lot of personal funding into that. So you can't always have these rich resources. Sometimes you have to kind of modulate down, I guess. And so we think about that a lot at Saylor Academy. How do we make sure that our site is accessible beyond the borders of the U.S., somewhere where someone may be relying on a mobile device. People increasingly use mobile devices over having a laptop or desktop. You have to think about what version of broadband, or even if they have access to it all the time. I recall someone earlier talking about access to electricity kind of being browned out in a certain region. I think it was Ms. Neal, if I remember correctly. I couldn't imagine being a working student and you get off of work at 8 o'clock knowing the electricity is going to be gone at 11, and you still have to do dinner and take care of family and all of that kind of stuff. We have to think about these kind of things and just maybe increase the diversity of the resources that we create, and increase the ways that we recognize that OER can be used. Maybe impact, and I think it's what Dr. Diallo said was very interesting, because we probably won't if we're doing it well, we probably will never be able to directly measure all of the impact. The most important thing is we want these resources to be shared and someone to be able to have the creativity to do something that we haven't imagined. At Saylor, we had a spike of students come to us from Morocco that we very lovingly call the Morocco spike. We have no idea where they came from. Someone found us, and we're not sure if they're using us as a class or something like that, but we had this surge of students come in, and we chuckle about it because it kind of threw all of our registration metrics off, but that should be the ideal situation where we just randomly, someone finds us and they find this great way to leverage us, and it's helping people. I know it makes things difficult on the stakeholder and investor and shareholder side when you want to be able to report, hey, somebody has found us useful, but I think it's better that people find you. And our analytics person, I can imagine them doing this. I think it's better that people are able to find you, use you. So I think infrastructure-wise and adaptation-wise, we have to find ways to educate the stakeholders in our systems to figure out how can we be more flexible to the needs of students. Who's the most important stakeholder? The people who are our end users. How do we figure out how to make this the best for them?
Oh, great. I do want to make sure that everyone here has chances to ask questions that I know they have. But I do want to ask you each one more question because, and you've already touched on this to some extent, but I wonder if you would be willing to talk about this. Is there any particular challenge or obstacle that you see coming up ahead or that gives you either concern or that we will need to be thinking about to address in the coming years?
In the coming years, for me, I think the biggest challenge is actually how to provide education to the underserved who cannot afford to pay for education. So the biggest challenge is how to lower the cost of providing education to these people. So OER is one solution because you can use free courses from everywhere, from our library or from other, and adapt it to your needs. But with all of that, we still need the resources. So moving forward, I think for me the biggest challenge is funding.
This is not a substitution for funding.
No, it's not. It's not. Well, it helps. It helps to lower the cost of education. But it is an extra mile. You have employees. You have to offer these courses. You have instructors. So there is a real cost. It's a minimum compared to if we didn't have the OERs. But it still needs funding to be able to move the massification through open education resources, using open education resources. And I think that this is one of the challenges we are encountering for us to open up the potential.
It's an ongoing challenge. Yeah. Thank you. Rajiv?
Yeah, no, I think you raise a good point. I mean, historically, there have been maybe 4 sources of funding for OER. There have been philanthropic organizations like the Hewlett Foundation, for example, or governments, British Columbia, lots of others. You've had professional societies, many cases, but increasingly universities. So I think in that last bit, I think one of the challenges we're seeing is OER has really gone mainstream now. Increasingly, if you look at universities, there's a position that 5 years ago didn't exist called OER librarian. This is a full-time staff position devoted to supporting faculty at many, many institutions. And as this becomes institutionalized, I think one of the tensions is we still are dragging along sort of a mindset. There's a functional fixedness of operating from traditional models without the affordances of open licensing, where we think, well, we need to create everything ourselves. Well, we're not going to reuse anything that's been created elsewhere. And you're really missing one of the biggest blessings of open educational resources are the collaborative affordances. So I think for me, one of the spaces which is a challenge for many institutions is to fully explore and exploit the collaborative affordances of collaborative OER development, peer review programs. I mean, there's an international network that we've worked with called the OERU that has about 40 or so members around the world. We're all contributing to open online courses that are really open, not the sort of fake open, FOPEN that you see with the MOOCs. I mean, entirely built with OER, you don't have to pay with your data, and all of the rest of that actually leads to academic credit. But we're not able to do this individually, right? We're able to do this collaboratively. And so I think availing fully of the collaborative affordances is a culture change question. And for me, the culture change question is much harder than the economic question. Because I can I can tell you this is the drop, this is how much the course withdrawal rate was lowered after implementing OER. Because students are no longer dropping the course because they can't afford the resources. I can tell you how much enrollment went up, and I can tell you how much all of that translates into tuition revenue for the institution. But that's not the interesting question for me. The interesting question is the culture change question. And while that's happened in my context, it's at various and early stages in many other contexts. So,
well, Dr. Sma yesterday mentioned something about the cultural, people not wanting to use others' work, and so it was just this obstacle. So anywhere you go, it's going to be a different cultural challenge, but it's going to be there, certainly. Thank you. All right, then.
I would say the largest challenge and opportunity that I see is particularly on the college credit acceptance and our university and college partnership side. I do see more institutions looking at partnering in terms of how do we help bring in students that we've lost or who may not have been interested in coming before. How do we become more flexible? And I think that's a change that has happened from recent years, and how that relates to us is we have a college credit program that we partner with universities, allowing students to take these OER-based courses at their own pace and then transfer them in for credit. And where that ties in, I think, is it's a recognition of the OER-based and really any resource that we create, as well as then licensed as Creative Commons. So they're completely OER courses. We don't use anything that's not OER-based. And I think that's where the greatest shift is happening. More recognition for resources like Saylor Academy for providers like Saylor Academy. But I think it's something that is still needed. A lot of the conversations that we've had here kind of have shown that universities can't look at themselves as standalone providers. Everybody is competing for attention. You're competing for someone's learning attention. As Michael Saylor said yesterday, your toughest competitor is YouTube. And behind that will be boot camps and maybe another provider or even a for-profit university that is saying that they're promising you a more open, FOPEN, I would say, experience because they have more lax admission standards and not giving that some, I guess I should say, so that we don't get in trouble. Providers are not giving that standard academic experience. But everyone is competing for someone's learning attention against someone else. And sometimes we could be, instead of competing, we could be collaborating more.
That's right.
As you had said before. And kind of leveraging each other's strengths. And OER really that's kind of the philosophy that's behind OER itself. Yeah. Let's leverage each other's strengths and recognize the quality that is coming from these different formats. Yeah,
there's quite a bit of noise, and I'm always amazed at how few people, or how more people don't know about Saylor and other opportunities like that are free. You can go on here and take a course for free and then get credit for it. Yeah. But there's so much noise and there's so much open washing and things like that and other sorts of challenges that they just get in the way. You're absolutely right. Absolutely. So I have more questions, but I want to make sure that folks here, because I see somebody with a microphone, right? Yeah, so please, wait till the microphone's there so the folks in the live stream can hear you as well. Is it on?
Okay.
There we go.
I think this is the heart of the matter that we've been discussing since yesterday. If we do not have systems in place to ensure that we can actually transfer credit. I think the bulk of the students, the bulk of the learners who are out there, out of the conventional systems, will still remain there because somebody has to pay the cost. And we need to discuss, we need to suggest, we need to recommend, we need to identify who is to pay that cost, because this is very, very critical. Dr. Bakri is about something that is very common with what we have at the National Open University of Nigeria. Here, we have science-based courses, but there are real challenges in terms of how do you run the practicals. So how do the OERs come in here to help? Like the courses you designed, they are basically in the natural sciences. So I need to know how the entire process of providing access to laboratories for practicals, I need to know how that is really handled and how that will actually facilitate learning. Sometimes we were discussing about simulation. But you are simulating what? I think we need to address that as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So, we started the experiment at the African Virtual University, I think it was in 2003, 2004, with a full bachelor in computer science that was delivered through 8 Anglophone countries and about 10 Francophone countries. So the model is, and then I think I talked about it a bit this morning, it's about collaboration. It's about collaboration. We work with partner institutions. And fortunately, AB was set a long time ago by the World Bank. And the model was to have what we call learning centers in different African universities. Today, we call them open distance and e-learning centers. So we have a collaboration between ABU and each of these partner institutions that if the program is delivered, the lecturer of a course could be based anywhere. But we have practicals in the individual partner institutions for a computer science program, for instance. So we have this infrastructure throughout our partner institutions. So this is how we've been handling, if it is even a certificate program in computer science. We know how to make an agreement, to have agreement with our partners, so who are actually in each of these countries. And then the student may be in any city, but you have to do practicals and you will have to go through those centers. So that's how we are addressing this issue. It's possible to do simulation. We have to make a difference between possibilities and reality. The reality is you don't have enough bandwidth in most of African countries for them to do simulation and stuff like that. So this is what we're doing for now.
If I can just jump in. So I'm going to maybe just address the first part of your question a little bit more. Quoting a couple of people. So one, Beverly Oliver was previously the Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor at Deakin University, which is doing a lot of wonderful work in this space. And I quote her when I say, be generous with credit. And that's, I think, again, an ethos that institutions would do well to embrace. So she's talking about many things. The recognition of prior learning, which we need to be a lot more generous with. I think institutions still feel this sense of territoriality and insecurity about if we give that up, then we will lose students and lose revenue. In fact, the more flexible you are, the more students you gain.
Yeah, that's true.
And then, of course, in conjunction with that, this is why it was not just OER by itself, but OER with RPL, or recognition of prior learning, OER with open recognition. So perhaps through RPL, you can award micro-credentials that stack to academic credit. There's a paper by Christine Wehack from Thompson Rivers University that lays out a model. This was in an open access journal called Open Praxis, of combining open educational learning, independent study-based open learning, together with prior learning in a way that really maximizes prior learning assessment and recognition. But I think the idea of being generous is key because, as been mentioned many times, 100 million more seats are needed between now and 2025 across the world. We don't have those seats. And I think we need to be flexible, but we need to be generous. But to do both, it requires shedding a little bit of that insecurity, which is oddly enough the same insecurity that inhibits the collaboration across institutions that we really should be engaging in. But I appreciate the question.
We actually have a
Just a quick thing that I forgot to mention, it's very important. In terms of accreditation, we have a joint accreditation system with our partner institution. For instance, we offer a certificate program with the University of Port Harcourt in Nigeria. So at the end of the course, the student who actually passed have a certificate which is recognized by the university. And we do that in Benin, we do that in Senegal. So we do have a system that allows us actually, at the end of a formal course, that the student get the credits that are recognized in the country they were. I'm sorry.
No worries. To Dr. John Diani's point, we have a program with the University of Memphis that combines Saylor Academy's open courses with recognition of prior learning to allow students who have stopped out of the university to come back. But I think, and so far we've had, it's called the Finish Line Project. So far, University of Memphis has been able to invite 600 students who had stopped out of university, were less than a year from finishing, and are able to come back and earn their degrees. And that's another facet of the skills gap. The bachelor's degree is binary. You have it or you don't, not dependent upon how many years you've been in college. Those years are not necessarily wasted in terms of the knowledge that you have, but in terms of what you can put on your resume, it's either there or it isn't. So that's a skills gap that we're addressing there. In terms of what Dr. Small was asking about, I think one of the things that I talk about a lot with others at Saylor Academy, if something is not easy to use, it's not open, it's not providing access. So the transfer credit process, the recognition of credit for prior learning process is not an easy process to navigate, not even in the US. Only maybe for institutions that are really, really passionate about it and kind of walk students through it. It might be easy for them on their end, but there are other things that students have to navigate. So creating an infrastructure that makes that process easier for students, because students will give up on the process if it isn't, I think is critical.
Good point. Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more, if there's a microphone. Oh, is somebody already?
Real quick, thank you for the comment about co-creation. I think that's really interesting. Quick reference, anybody here see The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind on Netflix?
The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind.
Got it. Okay. So the question I have is, imagine this young man or woman or any representative customer of your OER is sitting up on the stage. How would they design the solution that would solve their problem?
I'm not sure what the problem was. Did we see the movie?
I've not seen the movie.
Okay. Well, the problem that was identified was one, bandwidth and funding and co-creation. So there's a pathway to that. The bandwidth is solved by a telecom. There are about 6 in the world that run everything. If the person that has a phone, whether it be a cell phone that's a smartphone or a cell phone that's text-based, the question is, what's the shortest distance between the OER information and education and the human being that has the contextual need in the place they live? So if you strip away all the noise and the friction, you have a telecom, you already have OER, you've got tons of free resources, YouTube, Google, one company, one phone call. You've got Amazon that's got a drone that can deliver any textbook and drop it out of a drone. With a young man that solved the wind problem, which was really an energy problem for his village, used an old textbook. So everybody that doesn't have a smartphone, you ask Amazon to drop a drone with all the representative basic fundamental textbooks in the language of their country into their village. You can identify every 3 meter by 3 meter square on the planet through a technology called what 3 words? Yeah. They've identified every spot on the planet, 3 meters by 3 meters, and I can't do metric conversion, but it's pretty small. And you have drones that can sadly, kill anybody from space, but that means they also can drop a textbook somewhere. So the solution is at this place right now. The challenge is articulating the solution in a way that everybody wins. The sad thing is some people will lose. Sadly, it's the people that make a ton of money on the fact that a textbook today, in 2019, costs what it does when I can go on Kindle and get all the Plato works and everything else for nothing. So the solution is within about 6 steps of where we sit on the planet today with existing technology we have today. The issue is nobody's articulated it in a way that everyone can collaborate because everyone is afraid of losing something. So change the mindset, growth mindset, thank you very much, Carol Dweck, and then put it in the context where everybody is rowing in the same direction. Just a thought, not a sermon.
So, that was the answer, but yeah. I believe we have time for...
A very quick question, a question and a comment. So, what are the thoughts around, the shelf life of skills, and that's why we're here,
Yes.
is 4.5 years. So there's constant churn, roughly. So there's creating really well-designed learning resources, whether it's with multimedia or not, takes quite a time and effort. So how can we sustain this? And the second comment or question is as well, we constantly, and Rajiv talked about it as well, are we looking at OER beyond curriculum and content to open assessments, open credentials, of course, open analytics, open tools, all sorts of open stuff that make up the ecosystem for learning?
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. Let me try the first one about the shelf life of skills. I think one of the great things about OER, and you've heard some of the panelists talk about it, is that because the content can be localized and it can also be modified whenever it needs to be modified, it means that people who are working in a collaborative framework, as you've heard described here, can be much more responsive to changing needs, and can adapt in a moment. At my university now, there is a cybersecurity course that is using a textbook from January 2015, and I do not say that with pride. And I know that if we had used open materials to build that course, which we are now that I'm there, that course will be much more responsive to the environment that the students will be actually operating in. For the second part, though, I don't know if...
Sustain, how can we sustain?
Your second question.
Well, the second question around open transfer to
Assessment I know both of you know this, and so do you as well. So.
What you asked, Dr. Jagannath, really also pertains to leveraging those other open components so that, particularly so that instructors have all the things that they would need that kind of is comparable to a commercial resource. And I think being able to leverage different open platforms will probably be more helpful. I think it's how do you get all of those people together? That's always the difficulty that I see when I'm either trying to talk to someone or going to a conference somewhere where everyone's in their silo. So open government has its own conference. Well, why not invite political science professors to that conference so that they can learn what is going on in open government and invite their students to be able to leverage those resources? Why aren't you inviting people from a group of data analytics conference? Why aren't you inviting them to an open government? Because a lot of open government projects will deal with open data. So I think it's just how do you figure out how to get those minds together so that you have the cross-pollination that's needed.
It's really about opening the mind.
Yeah, making an
Yes,
open
as you're saying.
ecosystem.
Yeah.
A couple of things
Please,
to add to that.
this is the end, yeah.
So just quickly, I mean, I think there's many answers to the question of sustainability, but for me, I think the open pedagogy answer is a really, really fun one. So, for example, when we've had students, instead of giving another oral presentation in class, they're producing 2 to 3 minute instructional videos, and their videos, openly licensed, are now being used across the world to teach, for example, the principles of persuasion. I can point to one. Or instead of another research essay, they're learning how to edit Wikipedia. Their work is going to be seen by more people than will ever see a peer-reviewed article that I publish, for example, and that's wonderful. You know, there's textbooks that students are writing. So, but I will say, when you put it all together, there's many movements that are swimming sort of parallel streams at the moment, and increasingly they're filtering into one another. So, open science practices, you think for a moment in terms of researchers sharing data and research materials in open repositories, choosing to publish open access. All of this, of course, doubles as OER in various ways. So I do see these institutional moves. So federal granting agencies in Canada and the United States are embedding a requirement for research to end up in open repositories after a certain length of time. So if you're going to get federal funding, this is a requirement. Publicly funded research should be available to the public. It's not difficult to understand. And so as these levers are being pulled, these sort of defaults are being switched, I think those are the things that really help. Sometimes it takes aspirational, a sense of approach. I'm talking as a psychologist, approach motivation, right? You want to do something because it's attractive and aspirational. But sometimes it's avoidance motivation. And so, you know, I think policymakers have a big role to play. They've done it in Brazil, in Poland, in Canada, in the US, to shift the dial. By requiring open licensing, by supporting resources and infrastructure development to support OER, which in every context we've seen has been repaid 10 times over. But yeah.
And also entrepreneurs.
Yes.
I mean, I met
Yes.
Michael Dugamis had come to see me last week.
Yes.
Now, he's no longer an entrepreneur, but imagine his contribution to the LMS, Moodle. When it started. So it was that openness
source,
of
right.
mind
Open source software.
to not make money out of it. He was telling me that
Yeah.
Yes.
he could have, but
Yeah, so just maybe just very quickly, I think it's about actually having different stakeholders coming together and working together. In terms of policy making, I think our side of the world is a bit behind. So I have a lot of issues raising funds for OERs. Although it's a public good, it's helping, it's helpful. So I think we just need to sensitize policymakers, donors, funders, so that they can actually find that the way they are supporting public universities, that's the same way they should be supporting development of open education and open education practices. We are not there yet, we are pushing for it, but I think that's the way forward.
We're past time. I wish we did have more time. I appreciate your questions. Please, well, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I'm stepping in for Jeff Davidson, and I see that the program ends with a lunch and farewell, but it doesn't identify closing remarks or anything of that sort. So I thought I'll put that into the agenda if that's okay, Jackie. I'm Tom Heyer. I've worked alongside Michael Saylor for the last 15 years, helping him bring about his visions in various areas, including the founding and nurturing of the Saylor Academy. So as an organization, we've seen that this opportunity to bring people together and collaborate and exchange ideas is a great benefit that we can offer to the community. And I have to say that this session for the last 2 days has been incredible. Every one of the panels has been phenomenal. I certainly have tremendous energy from this group, and I can tell you we will be meeting the beginning of next week just saying, hey, how do we take this faster? You know, faster, faster, faster. We need to be agile. We need to see where things are going and how we can pull it together. And the world works in in a strange way. You know, we just can't program it all. We're all trying to find a way to program it. We can't, but we all have great ideas, and the ability to collaborate is phenomenal because we can do so much more and we can bring about real impact in the world. So that's our challenge, and again, I'm delighted that all of you have come here. I want to thank all of those who have spoken and attended. I know that's always difficult. Many of these folks have many other opportunities and have come out of a real sense of passion for our area, and we appreciate that. Obviously, I want to thank the Meridian. It's a phenomenal location that we've got here, and Ambassador Holliday has been very, very gracious, and the staff as well. On our side, I have to offer a great big thanks to Jackie Arnold. Jackie she spearheads this effort. It's an effort that is months and months in planning. I appreciate all of you who take her phone call, because just getting the phone call and getting to the people is difficult, and also to help refer us to other people. We will be back. We will do this again. We will be able to report on real progress, and all of you will have friends to come back to meet and to share what you've done and achieved in the collaborations. And for that, I think we're ready for lunch, and there's time to network and all. But again, thank you for bringing this to us.